The shuttle docked with a heavy clang that echoed through the steel corridors of Crucible 9, the largest military training station in the known galaxy. And Sergeant Cale Marin stepped off with nothing but a duffel bag over one shoulder and a long rifle case in her left hand. She was not impressive to look at. She stood about 5 feet 7 inches tall, with a lean frame and short brown hair tucked behind her ears, and skin that had been darkened by years under alien suns that were not kind to human flesh. And she wore standard Terran combat fatigues that looked plain and boring next to the gleaming armor and biosuits of the alien soldiers who filled the arrival bay. Crucible 9 was the home of the Advanced Marksmanship and Elimination Course, known across the galaxy as AMEC, and it was the single most respected sniper training program ever created, and every species in the Concord of Aligned Worlds sent their absolute best to compete for a place among the elite. Graduate from AMEC was to be recognized as one of the most dangerous individuals alive. Cale walked through the bay without looking at anyone, and she kept her eyes forward and her mouth shut, and her boots made soft sounds against the metal floor as she followed the guidance lights toward the barracks. The arrival bay was full of aliens. A group of Thessic warriors stood near the far wall, and they were enormous, each one standing close to 8 feet tall, with 4 muscular arms and scales the color of dark iron. Their eyes were gold and sharp, and they carried plasma rail rifles that hummed with barely contained energy, and they watched Cale pass with expressions that mixed confusion and amusement. Near the weapon racks, a pair of Valseri were adjusting their gear, and the Valseri were slender and graceful, and their skin could bend light around their bodies, making them nearly invisible to the naked eye, and they were natural-born ghosts, and they had been the top species in AMEC for over 60 years running, and they barely glanced at Cale before returning to their work. A squad of craft hunters crouched in the corner, and they were covered in short dark fur, and their wide eyes glowed faintly orange because they could see in thermal vision, and they could track a warm-blooded target through solid walls and dense jungle and blizzard conditions, and they were considered the finest trackers in the galaxy. And then there was Cale, one human woman with no visible augmentations, no active camouflage, no biological advantages, and a rifle case that looked like it belonged in a museum. The cohort assembled in the main briefing hall 1 hour later, and Instructor Drayan Vorsal stood at the front. And he was a Thessic, but older than the trainees. His scales faded to a pale silver, and he had 4 arms that he kept folded behind his back, and his gold eyes moved across the room slowly, studying each face. 7 species, he said in a voice that was deep and calm, and carried the weight of someone who had seen more combat than most of them could imagine. You are here because your governments believe you are the best your worlds have to offer, and over the next 90 days, I will find out if they were right or if they were lying to me. He began the introductions, and each species was invited to present their capabilities. The Thessic went first, and their lead trainee, a massive warrior named Ronak, stepped forward and lifted his plasma rail rifle with 2 arms, while his other 2 hands activated a tactical display showing his kill record from border skirmishes. 187 confirmed eliminations at distances exceeding 2 kilometers. The Valseri pair went next, and without warning, they simply vanished, and the room gasped as the 2 snipers disappeared completely from sight, and even the craft thermal hunters squinted and struggled to track them, and the Valseri reappeared 10 seconds later with quiet smiles on their angular faces. The craft demonstrated their thermal lock, identifying every warm body in the room through the walls of the adjacent corridor, calling out exact positions and heart rates with casual precision. Then it was Cale's turn. She stood up and walked to the front, and she carried nothing and activated nothing, and she simply said, "Sergeant Cale Marin, Terran Armed Forces, solo assignment." The room was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. Then Ronak laughed. It was a deep, rumbling sound that came from his chest, and it spread fast, and the other Thessic joined in. And then the Krath were chittering, and even the Valseri exchanged looks that were clearly amused, and the whole room was filled with the sounds of 7 species laughing at one small human woman. "Solo?" Ronak said, his gold eyes bright with disbelief. "The mammals sent one soldier with no team and no technology? Is this meant to be a joke? Did your species misunderstand the invitation?" Kale looked at him, and her face showed nothing, not anger, not embarrassment, not defiance, just a calm and steady blankness that was neither warm nor cold. She turned and walked back to her seat, and sat down, and said nothing else. The laughter continued for a while, and then it faded, and the briefing moved on, and Vorsal explained the structure of the course, and the evaluation exercises, and the final trial. And Kale listened, and took no notes, because she did not need to. After the briefing, the trainees filed out, and Kale went to her bunk, and she unpacked her duffel bag, and inside was a ghillie suit that looked handmade, and worn, and patched in dozens of places, and a set of basic optics, and 5 boxes of ammunition, and nothing else. She laid the ghillie suit out on her bed, and ran her fingers along the fabric, and then she began cleaning her rifle with slow and careful movements, each motion practiced and automatic. Like a prayer, she had repeated 10,000 times. Up on the observation deck, Vorsal stood with his aide, a young Thessic named Palix, and they watched the barracks feed on a screen. "Sir," Palix said, "why was a solo human approved for the program? She has no augmentations, and her weapon uses chemical propellant, and she has no spotter, and no drone support, and no cloaking capability." Vorsal did not answer right away. He pulled up Kale's personnel file on his display, and most of it was black, redacted at the highest levels of Terran military classification. And what little remained was bare. Name, rank, age, blood type, and a single note at the bottom, written by hand by a Terran general whose name Vorsal recognized as one of the most decorated human commanders alive. The note read, "She does not need a team, because she is the team, and I strongly advise you treat her with respect, or do not engage with her at all." Vorsal read it twice, and then closed the file. "Sir?" Palax asked again. Vorsal looked down at the barracks feed, where Kale was still cleaning her rifle, with those slow and steady hands, and his crest, the ridge of bone and cartilage along his skull that rose and fell with his emotions, lay completely flat against his head. That was a sign of deep unease. "What did the humans send me?" he said quietly, and it was not a question he expected anyone to answer. The biodome was a massive enclosed wilderness that stretched across 200 square kilometers of Crucible 9, and it contained 4 distinct zones: a dense tropical jungle, a frozen tundra, a rocky desert, and a jagged mountain range, all built to simulate the most difficult terrain a sniper would ever face in real combat. The rules of the stalking trial were simple. Each team would be dropped into the biodome for 72 hours, and during that time, they had to locate and tag as many opposing teams as possible, using simulation rounds that registered a hit on contact. And at the same time, they had to remain undetected, because getting spotted by the drone network or by another team's sensors would cost them points, even if they were not tagged. It was a test of 2 things, the ability to kill and the ability to disappear. The teams deployed at dawn on the first day, and the Thessic fire team led by Ronak took the mountain ridge because high ground was everything in Thessic doctrine, and they set up overlapping fields of fire with their plasma rail systems, and their position looked unbreakable. The Valseri pair slipped into the jungle and activated their natural camouflage, and they became invisible to the naked eye, and moved through the undergrowth like wind through tall grass, silent and unseen. The Krath hunters spread across the tundra, where their thermal vision gave them total awareness of every warm body within a kilometer, and they crouched low and waited with the patience of born predators. Kale walked into the jungle alone, carrying her rifle and her ghillie suit and a canteen of water and 3 days' worth of ration bars, and within 10 minutes of entering the tree line, she was gone. Not gone as in hard to find, gone as in she stopped existing. In the observation room high above the biodome, Instructor Vorzal and his staff monitored every team through a network of drones, thermal scanners, motion detectors, and electromagnetic sensors that covered every square meter of the arena. And within the first hour, they had confirmed the positions of every single team, except one. "Where is the human?" asked one of the Krath instructors, scrolling through thermal feeds. "Expand the search grid," Vorsal said. They expanded it, and they found nothing. "Run motion analysis on the jungle sector." Nothing. "Electromagnetic sweep." Nothing. A Valseri instructor tilted her head and said, "Perhaps she has already been tagged and eliminated." Vorsal shook his head slowly. "No team has reported contact, and no simulation round has been registered, and she is out there." "Then where?" the Valseri asked. Vorsal did not answer, because he did not know, and that fact unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. The first 24 hours passed, and the alien teams performed well, and the scoreboard lit up with confirmed tags as teams hunted each other across the biodome, and the Valseri pair was in the lead with 3 kills, and the Krath were close behind with 2. And Ronak's Thesic team held the high ground, and had tagged one team that tried to approach their ridge. Kale had 0 kills and 0 detections, and some of the instructors began to wonder if she had simply hidden herself so well that she could not find anyone either. Then hour 36 arrived. Ronak's fire team was positioned on a rocky ledge overlooking a valley, and they had been there for 6 hours, and they were confident in their position because they had drone support and overlapping sensor coverage, and 3 of the best marksmen in the Thesic military watching every approach. The first shot hit Ronak in the center of his chestplate, and the simulation round burst green across his armor, and he looked down in shock. The second shot hit the Thesic to his left, before Ronak's body had even begun to fall. Shot hit the last team member as he spun around, trying to find the source of fire. 3 shots, 3 kills, 8 seconds. The observation room erupted. "Where did that come from?" the Krath instructor demanded, pulling up every sensor feed in the area. They ran the data, and the shots had originated from a position in the jungle, 1,400 meters from the ridge, from inside a zone that the drones had scanned 12 minutes earlier and declared completely empty. "That is impossible," the Krath instructor said. "We swept that area, and there was nothing. No thermal signature, no motion, no electromagnetic output, nothing." Vorsal leaned forward in his chair, and his golden eyes were fixed on the screen, and his crest was flat against his skull. "She was already there," he said quietly. "She was there when the drones passed, and she was so still and so cold that they registered her as part of the terrain." Silent. The next 12 hours were a nightmare for the remaining teams. At hour 42, Kale tagged a Krath hunting pair in the tundra, and the Krath had been using their thermal vision to scan for threats, and they never saw her, because she had buried herself in snow and mud, and reduced her body temperature so low that she was indistinguishable from the frozen ground around her, and she waited until they passed within 200 meters. And then she took them both with 2 shots so fast they sounded like one. At hour 48, she found the Valseri who were invisible, the Valseri who could bend light around their bodies and vanish from every visual spectrum. Kale shot them from 1,800 meters away, through tiny gaps in the jungle canopy, while they were fully cloaked and moving through dense undergrowth on a route they had scouted specifically for electronic countermeasures. The observation room could not process what they were seeing. "She cannot see them," the Valseri instructor said, standing up from her chair. "That is physically impossible. She has no augmented optics, no thermal overlay, no motion tracking. She has baseline human eyes. Vorsal spoke, and his voice was calm, but there was something underneath it, something that might have been awe. She did not see them, he said. She read the jungle. She watched the way the leaves moved when they should have been still. She listened for the places where insects went quiet. She tracked the micro-disturbances in air currents caused by two bodies displacing space, even while invisible, and then she calculated their trajectory and pre-positioned herself along their path and waited. He paused. She hunted them the way her ancestors hunted on her homeworld, with patience and observation and the absolute refusal to exist until the moment she chose to kill. The trial ended at hour 72. Kale had tagged 11 teams. She had never been detected, not once, not by any drone or sensor or biological sense organ in the entire biodome. She walked out of the jungle covered in mud and leaves and sweat, and she carried her rifle over her shoulder, and her face was blank and calm, and she walked past the other trainees without a word, and went to her bunk and sat down and began cleaning her weapon. The scoreboard was posted on the main display in the barracks, and every trainee gathered to look at it. And Kale's name was at the top, by a margin so wide that it broke every record AMEC had ever kept, going back over 400 years of operation. Ronak stood in front of the board and stared at it for a long time, and his four hands were clenched at his sides, and his jaw was tight. In the days after the stalking trial, the barracks became a very different place, and the change was not sudden, but it was real, and it started with curiosity, and then it became something closer to fear. It began with Ronak. The big Thessic could not sleep the night after the trial, and he lay in his oversized bunk, staring at the ceiling, and replaying the moment the simulation round hit his chest, and he kept asking himself the same question over and over. How did she do it? So he opened his data terminal, and he searched for human military history, and specifically he searched for human snipers. What he found kept him awake until morning. He found the story of a human named Simo Heha, a small, quiet man from a cold northern country on Earth, who fought in a war centuries ago. And in 100 days of brutal winter combat, this one man killed over 500 enemy soldiers using a rifle with no magnified optic, just simple iron sights, because he refused to use a scope since the glass could catch light and reveal his position. And he did this in temperatures that would kill most species in hours. And the enemy sent their best counter-snipers after him, and artillery strikes, and entire infantry units, and they never got him, and they called him the White Death. Ronak read about Carlos Hathcock, another human sniper who once crawled across an open field for 4 straight days to reach a single target. And he moved inches at a time, controlling his heartbeat and breathing, and staying so flat against the earth that soldiers walked within meters of him without seeing him. And after taking his shot, he crawled back the same way. He read about Lyudmila Pavlichenko, a human female who killed 309 enemy soldiers before she turned 26 years old, and she was so effective that the enemy forces in her sector refused to advance during daylight hours because they knew she was watching. Ronak sat back in his bunk, and his scales had gone pale, which was the Thessic equivalent of going white in the face. By the next morning, every trainee in the cohort had read the same files. The Krath were particularly disturbed because they found a Terran military doctrine paper titled Ghillie Warfare, the Psychological Weapon, and the paper explained something that the Krath had never considered. That the greatest weapon a sniper carried was not the rifle, but the fear. And the paper argued that a single sniper could paralyze an entire army, not by killing everyone, but by killing just enough to make every surviving soldier believe they were next. And the paper described how enemy combatants who knew a human sniper was operating in their area would often refuse to move, refuse to eat, refuse to sleep, and would eventually collapse from exhaustion and terror, without a single additional shot being fired. The Krath hunter who had laughed at Kale on the first day closed his terminal, and sat very still for a long time. The Valseri reacted differently, because they were a species that prided themselves on being unseen. And the idea that a baseline human, with no augmentation, had tracked and killed their cloaked operatives through nothing but environmental observation was not just surprising. It was an existential challenge to their identity as the galaxy's premier stealth species. And they spent hours reviewing the drone footage from the trial, slowing it down frame by frame, trying to find the moment Kale had detected their cloaked pair. And they never found it, because there was no single moment. There was just a patient human lying in the mud, reading the world around her the way her species had been reading the world for 300,000 years. While the cohort was studying human history, Kale was called to Instructor Vorsal's office. She walked in and stood at attention, and Vorsal sat behind his desk, with his forearms resting on the surface, and his gold eyes studied her face for a long moment before he spoke. "I requested further declassification of your service record," he said, "and Terran Command granted partial access." Kale said nothing. "You served in the Frontier Wars," Vorsal continued, "specifically on Cinder 4, a volcanic world where a Terran colony was besieged by Rethkari raiders for 14 months. Kale's expression did not change. "You were part of a 6-person sniper team, deployed behind enemy lines to slow the Rethkari advance and disrupt their supply chains," Vorsal said, and then he paused and looked at the file. "Your team was killed in the second week." The silence in the room was heavy. "For the remaining 13.5 months, you operated alone, behind enemy lines," Vorsal said. "You survived on foraged food and collected rainwater, and you moved constantly through volcanic terrain that registered surface temperatures exceeding 60 degrees, and you were credited with 434 confirmed kills." He looked up from the file. "The Rethkari are pack hunters," he said. "They use echolocation to navigate and hunt, and they are considered one of the most dangerous ground combat species in the outer systems. And yet they could not find you, a single human operating alone in their territory for over a year." He set the file down. "Do you know what they called you?" he asked. "Yes," Kale said, and it was the first word she had spoken since entering the room. "Dravel," Vorsal said, and the alien word sounded strange, coming from his Thessic mouth. In their language it means, "the silence that kills." Kale looked at him, and Vorsal saw something in her eyes that he had not seen before, not because it was new, but because he was only now learning to recognize it. A stillness that went deeper than calm, deeper than discipline, a stillness that belonged to someone who had spent over a year living as a ghost in a burning hellscape, killing every day and sleeping in the ash, and watching her targets through her scope, and waiting with a patience that no other species could match, because no other species had been built for it the way humans were. "You are not here to learn, are you, Sergeant?" Vorsal asked. "No, sir," Kale replied. "Then why are you here?" "My commanders believed it was time for the other species to understand what humans are capable of," she said, and her voice was flat and even, and carried no pride and no threat, just a simple statement of fact. Vorsal studied her, and his crest lay flat, and he felt something he had not felt in decades of training the deadliest soldiers the galaxy had to offer. He felt small. "And what are humans capable of?" he asked. Kale stood straight, and her dark eyes held his gold ones without flinching. "Patience," she said. She left the office, and the door closed behind her, and Vorsal sat alone. A long time. Then he opened the cohort-wide communication channel, and every trainee on Crucible 9 heard his voice come through their earpieces. "Attention all AMEC trainees," he said. "The final evaluation has been moved forward, and the format has been changed, and the exercise will be a full combat simulation in the biodome, all teams operating together against a single target." He paused, and the silence stretched across every bunk and every corridor. "You will be hunting Sergeant Marin," he said, "and I suggest you take it very seriously." He closed the channel, And in the barracks, 40 pairs of alien eyes looked at each other, and for the first time since arriving at Crucible 9, every single one of them was afraid. The biodome had been reconfigured overnight, and the sensor network had been tripled, and the drone count had been increased from 50 to 200, and every square meter of the arena was now covered by overlapping thermal, motion, and electromagnetic surveillance, and the rules were clear. 39 trainees, working together with full access to every piece of technology their species possessed, against one human with a rifle and a ghillie suit, and 48 hours to find and tag her. Kale deployed at dawn from the southern gate. She carried her rifle, 3 days of water, a handful of ration bars, her handmade ghillie suit, and nothing else. No comm device, no scanner, no drone, no technology of any kind. The 39 hunters deployed from the northern gate in a coordinated formation that had been planned through the entire previous night. And they had divided themselves into strike groups and overwatch teams and mobile patrols, and they had shared every piece of intelligence they had on human capabilities, and they had studied the stalking trial footage, and they believed they understood what they were dealing with. They were wrong. The first 12 hours were a disaster. The hunters swept the jungle zone in a careful grid pattern, with Kroth thermal trackers on point, and Valseri cloakers on the flanks, and Thessic heavy teams holding high ground, and the 200 drones flew continuous overhead patterns, scanning for any sign of human presence, and they found nothing. Kale was not in the jungle. She was not in the tundra, or the desert, or the mountains either, at least not according to any sensor in the biodome. At hour 4, she took her first shot. A Kroth tracker named Voss was moving through a shallow riverbed when a simulation round hit him in the throat, and the round had come from somewhere inside the waterfall at the end of the river, a curtain of falling water that every sensor had dismissed as background noise, and that no thermal scan could penetrate because the water disrupted infrared signatures. Voss never saw her, and neither did the 8 other hunters within 500 meters of his position. The cohort reacted immediately, and 3 strike teams converged on the waterfall, and they searched every rock and every shadow, and they scanned every frequency, and they found nothing. Not a footprint, not a fiber from her ghillie suit, not a single trace that a human being had ever been there. She had already moved. At hour 9, she tagged 2 more hunters, a Thessic pair holding overwatch on a cliff face, and she shot them from a position inside a dead tree trunk that was over a kilometer away. And the trunk had been scanned by drones 3 times in the previous hour, and each time it had registered as solid wood with no thermal signature inside. How is she reducing her body heat to match dead wood? A Krath instructor asked in the observation room. Vorsal watched the feeds with his arms folded behind his back, and said, "Humans have a technique called metabolic suppression, and through years of training they can slow their heart rate to below 30 beats per minute, and reduce peripheral blood flow until their extremities match ambient temperature. And she has been doing this for so long that it is no longer a technique for her. It is simply what she is." By hour 15, the cohort had lost 7 members, and panic was beginning to set in. The remaining 32 hunters pulled back and regrouped, and arguments broke out between species, and the Krath wanted to abandon the jungle entirely because their thermal advantage was useless against a target that could control her own body heat. And the Valseri wanted to set a trap using themselves as bait, but the others pointed out that Kale had already proven she could detect cloaked Valseri through environmental observation alone. "We are thinking like prey," he said, and his deep voice cut through the noise. "And she is counting on that, because fear is her weapon as much as that rifle. And we need to stop running and start thinking." He organized a coordinated sweep, every hunter moving in a single massive formation across the biodome from north to south, with no gaps and no blind spots, and every drone focused on the ground ahead of them. It was a good plan. It did not matter. At hour 20, Kale tagged a Valseri sniper who was actively cloaked and completely stationary and hidden inside a carefully chosen position beneath a fallen tree. and she was invisible to every sensor and every eye in the biodome. And Kale shot her from 900 meters away through a gap in the canopy that was barely wider than a fist. The observation room went completely silent. A visiting Thessic general, who had come to watch the exercise, leaned forward and whispered, "She is not a sniper. She is a predator." Vorsal shook his head slowly. "No," he said, "a predator relies on instinct, and Sergeant Marin relies on something far more dangerous, intelligence applied with infinite patience. And her species has a name for it. They call it the long hunt." He turned to the general. "Humans evolved on a world where they were not the fastest, or the strongest, or the most dangerous creature on their planet," he said. "So they developed a different strategy, and they would choose a target and then follow it, not chasing it but simply following, walking at a steady pace, tracking its footprints and its scent and its disturbed surroundings. And they would follow it for hours, and then days, until the target, no matter how fast or how strong, collapsed from exhaustion, because the one thing humans could do better than any other creature on their world was refuse to stop." He looked back at the screens. "That is what she is doing to them," he said. "Outrunning them or outfighting them, she is outlasting them. She is breaking them with patience. And they do not know how to fight an enemy whose greatest weapon is the willingness to wait." By hour 35, only 7 hunters remained untagged, and they had abandoned all strategy except survival. And they had fortified a position in the mountain zone on a rocky plateau with clear sightlines in every direction, and overlapping fields of fire and sensor coverage from every remaining drone. They were certain she could not approach without being detected. They were right that she could not approach. She did not need to. Kale had crawled to a position 30 meters from the plateau 18 hours earlier, before the 7 hunters had even chosen that location. And she had buried herself in the loose gravel and rocky soil, and covered herself with her ghillie suit and stones. And she had lain motionless for nearly an entire day, with her heartbeat at 28 beats per minute, and her breathing so shallow that her chest barely moved, and the drones had passed over her position dozens of times, and registered nothing but rock and dirt. She had predicted their fallback position. She had analyzed the terrain of the entire biodome, and calculated which location offered the best defensive advantages. And she had known that frightened soldiers always seek high ground with clear sight lines, and she had simply gone there first and waited. At hour 40, she opened her eyes. 11 seconds later, all 7 hunters were tagged. 7 shots, 7 hits, 11 seconds. The exercise ended at hour 41, 7 hours early, because there was no one left to hunt. In the observation room, nobody spoke for a long time, and the screens showed 39 red markers scattered across the biodome, each one representing a tagged hunter, and in the center of it all was a single green marker that had never once turned yellow for detection. Kale Marin had defeated the entire cohort alone. The hunters filed out of the biodome in silence, and they were not angry, and they were not humiliated. They were something else, something deeper. They were changed. Ronak was the last to leave the field, and he walked slowly toward the barracks, and he saw Kale standing near the entrance with her rifle over her shoulder, and her ghillie suit draped over one arm, and mud on her face and in her hair, and she looked tired, but her eyes were the same as they had always been, still and calm and endlessly patient. He stopped in front of her, and for a moment neither of them moved. Then Ronak brought his 2 lower fists together and pressed them against his chest, and he bowed his great scaled head, and it was the Thessic salute of a warrior acknowledging a superior, a gesture so old and so sacred that it was almost never used, and it had never in recorded history been offered to a human. And she nodded once, a small quiet movement, and then she turned and walked away. Ronak stood there for a while, and then he followed, and behind him The biodome was empty and silent, and the drones circled overhead, finding nothing because there was nothing left to find. The graduation hall of Crucible 9 was a wide circular chamber with high ceilings and polished metal walls, and it had been built to hold ceremonies for the most elite soldiers in the galaxy. And on this day, every seat was filled. The 40 trainees of the cohort sat in the front rows, and behind them were officers and dignitaries from 7 species who had traveled across the galaxy to witness the graduation of the latest AMEC class. And the air was thick with the quiet tension that comes when something important is about to happen, and everyone in the room knows it. Instructor Drayan Vorzal stood at the center of the stage, and he wore his formal Thesic military armor, silver and black, and his forearms were clasped behind his back, and his gold eyes swept the room with the slow, careful gaze of someone who had spent a lifetime studying warriors. He began to speak. 90 days ago, you arrived on this station as strangers, he said, and his deep voice filled the hall without effort. You came from different worlds, and different species, and different traditions of warfare, and many of you believed that your way was the best way, and that your biology or your technology made you superior. He paused. You were wrong. The room was very still. The purpose of AMEC has never been to determine which species produces the best sniper, Vorsal said. The purpose has always been to teach you something far more important, to teach you what makes a true warrior, and to show you that the most dangerous being in the galaxy is not always the one you expect. He looked at the front row, where the trainees sat, and his eyes moved across faces he had come to know over 3 months. Ronak with his iron scales and gold eyes, the Valseri pair with their shimmering skin, the Krath hunters with their glowing orange gaze, and all the others. Each one changed in ways that went deeper than skill or technique. When Sergeant Kale Marin arrived at this station, many of you laughed, Vorsal said, and he did not say it with accusation but with the calm tone of a teacher presenting a lesson. You saw a small mammal from a young species with no biological enhancements, no cloaking technology, no thermal vision, and a weapon that used chemical propellant, a design so old that most of your species abandoned it centuries ago. He let the silence hold for a moment. You saw weakness, he said, and I understood why, because by every metric you used to measure a soldier, she appeared to be outmatched in every possible way. He stepped forward. But I saw something different, he said. I saw the look in her eyes, and it was a look I have seen before in the eyes of human soldiers, a look that is difficult to describe to anyone who has not faced it, and it is not aggression, and it is not confidence, and it is not even courage. He paused, and when he spoke again his voice was lower. It is patience, said, the deep and terrible patience of a species that was built to endure. He turned and walked slowly across the stage. Over these 90 days, you have learned what humans are, he said. You have studied their history, and you have seen their capabilities firsthand. And I hope you understand now that what makes humanity dangerous is not any single trait, but the combination of all of them. The intelligence to read a battlefield the way others read a book. The discipline to lie motionless for days without food or water or movement. The creativity to turn any environment into a weapon, and above all, the patience to wait as long as it takes, forever if necessary, for the perfect moment to act. He stopped walking and faced the audience. Humans did not reach the stars because they were the strongest or the fastest species on their world, he said. They reached the stars because they refused to stop. And when they were hungry, they learned to hunt. And when the prey was faster, they learned to outlast it. And when the world was cold, they learned to build fire. And when the fire went out, they learned to carry the warmth inside themselves. And they never stopped, not once in 300,000 years of existence. And that is what makes them terrifying. He turned to look at Kale, who sat in the second row between Ronak and a Krauth hunter, and she was wearing her clean Terran dress uniform, and her short brown hair was combed, and her face was calm, and she looked like the quietest and least remarkable person in the room. In the old Thessic warrior traditions, Vorsal said, there is a title that is given only to a fighter who has transcended the physical, a warrior who kills not with strength or speed, but with presence and patience and inevitability, a being who exists between the seen and the unseen, who is everywhere and nowhere at once, whose very existence on a battlefield changes the behavior of every enemy who knows they are. His crest rose to its full height, the sharp ridge of bone standing tall along his skull, and every Thessic in the room recognized it as the highest expression of respect their species could offer. We call such a being a living ghost, Vorsal said. The room was absolutely silent. In 400 years of this program, across 14 species and tens of thousands of graduates, I have awarded this title 3 times, he said, and then he looked directly at Kale. Today I award it a 4th time. He extended all 4 of his arms toward her, palms open, in the ancient Thessic gesture of honor. Sergeant Kale Marin, he said, you are a living ghost. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then Ronak stood, and he brought his lower fist to his chest and bowed his head. And the other Thessic trainees rose with him and did the same, and the sound of their fists striking their chest plates echoed through the hall like drums, began to hum, and it was a low vibrating sound that came from deep in their throats, a war hymn that their species sang only for those they considered worthy of the highest honor, and the sound filled the room like the pulse of a living thing. The Valseri shimmered, and their skin rippled with bands of light and color that moved across their bodies like waves on water. And this was their species' deepest expression of awe and wonder, and it was beautiful to see. One by one, every species in the room found their own way to mark the moment. Clicks and calls and gestures and postures that each carried the weight of ancient tradition. And the hall was filled with the sound of 7 civilizations paying tribute to one quiet human woman. Kale stood, and she looked at Vorsal, and she gave a single nod, small and precise and carrying no more emotion than was necessary, and then she sat back down. And that was enough. After the ceremony, the cohort gathered in the common area for the last time, and there was talking and laughing and the sharing of drinks from 7 different homeworlds. And the barriers that had existed between species on the first day were gone now, dissolved by shared experience and shared respect. Ronak found Kale standing by the observation window, looking out at the stars, and he stood next to her, and for a while neither of them spoke. I have a question, he said finally. Kale looked up at him. On the first day I laughed at you, he said, and you said nothing, and your face showed nothing, and I want to know, were you angry? Kale considered the question. No, she said. Why not? Because anger is loud, she said, and loud is the first thing that gets you killed. Ronak looked at her, and then he laughed, a real laugh, deep and warm, and Kale's mouth moved just slightly at the corner in what might have been the ghost of a smile. Years passed, and the cohorts scattered across the ocean, galaxy, and they served in different fleets and on different worlds, but they carried the same lesson with them wherever they went. Kale's name became a legend, and the story of the human ghost who defeated 39 elite alien snipers alone spread through military academies on 100 worlds. And sniper doctrines were rewritten, and training manuals were updated, and the phrase "check for humans" became standard operating procedure in field guides across the Concord. But the true legacy was not tactical, and it was not strategic. It was the understanding that spread quietly through the ranks of every species in the galaxy. The understanding that humans were not to be underestimated, not because they were the biggest or the strongest or the most advanced, but because they were the most patient and the most stubborn and the most unwilling to quit of any species that had ever reached the stars. And somewhere out there, on some unnamed world, in some forgotten patch of jungle or desert or frozen waste, A quiet woman with a worn rifle and a handmade ghillie suit was watching. She was always watching. And by the time you knew she was there, it was already far too late.